"Don't send another waitress, I don't want to be served," the man said without even looking up, his voice calm, controlled, and somehow more intimidating than a shout. The restaurant fell into a strange kind of silence, the kind that spreads table by table until even the soft clinking of silverware feels too loud. Table 12. Everyone knew it now. The man who sat there had been coming in for weeks, always alone, always dressed simply but sharply, and always sending waitresses away within minutes. Some said he tipped nothing. Others said he left $1,000 tips just to confuse people. No one really knew the truth. What they did know was simple: if you valued your shift, your dignity, or your sanity, you stayed away from table 12. Behind the bar, a nervous hostess leaned toward the manager. "We're short tonight, we can't just ignore him again." The manager exhaled slowly, scanning the room, his eyes landing on someone near the edge of the dining floor. "Sophie." Sophie Bennett looked up from balancing a tray of iced water glasses, her expression unreadable. She was new compared to most of the staff, but not inexperienced. At 26, she had already worked more double shifts than she could count, already learned what it meant to smile when she didn't feel like it, and already decided there was one thing she would never do again: pretend to be less than she was just to make someone else feel bigger. "Yeah," she said, setting the tray down carefully. The manager hesitated, lowering his voice. "I need you to take table 12. Around her, a couple of waitresses exchanged looks, half pity, half relief it wasn't them. One whispered under her breath, "Good luck." Another added, "Don't take it personally when he sends you away." Sophie glanced across the room. The man at table 12 hadn't moved. His posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed, like someone completely unaffected by the tension he created. A glass of water sat untouched in front of him. No phone. No menu. Just stillness. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron once, slow and deliberate. "What's his deal?" she asked. The manager shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Just be careful." Sophie let out a quiet breath, but there was no fear in it. Only something sharper. "I'm not here to be careful," she said. And then she picked up a menu and started walking. Each step toward table 12 seemed louder than it should have been, heels tapping softly against polished wood floors, drawing the attention of people who pretended not to look. She could feel it, the weight of expectation, the silent countdown to another awkward failure. But Sophie didn't slow down. Didn't rehearse a fake smile. Didn't soften her shoulders. When she reached the table, she stopped just enough distance away to be professional, but not submissive. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, natural, unforced. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a minute?" The man finally looked up. His eyes met hers, sharp and observant, like he wasn't just seeing her, but measuring something deeper. There was a pause, longer than normal, stretching just enough to make most people uncomfortable. Sophie didn't fill it. She didn't fidget. She didn't rush to speak again. She simply waited. And for the first time since he had started coming to this restaurant, the man at table 12 didn't send the waitress away. Instead, something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression, like a crack in a perfectly controlled surface. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Why aren't you afraid?" Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering him for half a second before answering. "Because you're just a customer," she said. "And I'm just doing my job." Another pause. But this one felt different. Not tense. Not hostile. Curious. Around them, the restaurant slowly exhaled, unaware that something small, but irreversible, had just begun to change. The man leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her as if she had just broken a rule he did not know could be broken, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table while the untouched glass of water caught the warm glow of the overhead lights and reflected it across his face, but his eyes never left hers, not even for a second, and Sophie could feel it, not pressure exactly, but attention, focused and deliberate, the kind that most people avoided but she did not anymore. Not after Everything that had taught her what it meant to stand her ground without raising her voice, without apologizing for existing in a room that tried to make her feel smaller than she was, and when he did not respond right away, she simply reached for her notepad, calm, precise, as if this moment was no different from any other order she had taken that night, even though every instinct in the room said otherwise. "We have a ribeye that is popular tonight," she said evenly, her tone informative but not persuasive. 12 ounces, served with roasted potatoes and seasonal vegetables, or there is a salmon dish with lemon butter if you prefer something lighter. She did not oversell, did not soften her voice, did not try to impress him, and that alone seemed to catch him off guard in a way that no mistake or nervous apology ever could, his brow shifting slightly as if recalibrating something in his mind. "You are not trying very hard to convince me," he said after a moment, his voice low but sharper now, testing, probing, and Sophie met it without hesitation. "I am giving you the options," she replied. "What you choose is up to you." There was no challenge in her tone, no defiance, just clarity, and somehow that made it stronger, the kind of answer that did not invite argument because it did not need to defend itself, and for a brief second, something like amusement flickered across his face before disappearing just as quickly, replaced by that same controlled neutrality he had worn when she first approached. But the shift had happened, and Sophie had seen it. "Ribeye," he said finally, closing the menu without looking down at it again. "Medium rare." She nodded once, writing it down with clean, practiced strokes. "And to drink?" she asked, already knowing he might not answer, already prepared for silence, but instead he tilted his head slightly, watching her again as if this part mattered more than it should. "Surprise me," he said. And this time there was something different beneath the words, something less like a command and more like a question he was not saying out loud. Sophie paused for half a second, just enough to consider, then closed her notepad. "All right," she said simply, turning to leave without another word, and as she walked away, the tension that had wrapped itself around the restaurant began to loosen, whispers starting up again in low voices as staff exchanged glances. One of the waitresses near the service station leaned in, eyes wide. "He did not send you away," she whispered, almost disbelieving, and Sophie shrugged lightly as she reached for a clean glass. "He just wanted to order dinner," she said, as if that was all it had ever been. But across the room, the man at table 12 watched her go, his expression no longer unreadable, not entirely. There was something there now, something awake, something engaged, and when the manager cautiously stepped closer to check in, he raised a hand slightly without looking at him, a silent signal to stop, to stay back, to let it play out, and for the first time since he had started coming here, the man did not seem interested in pushing people away. Instead he sat there, waiting. Not for the food, not for the service, but for her to come back. When Sophie returned, she did not rush, did not carry the kind of urgency most waitresses adopted around difficult tables. Instead she moved with the same steady rhythm she had from the beginning, balancing a tray with a single glass and a neatly plated appetizer that was not on the menu, something simple but intentional, and when she set the drink down in front of him, the faint scent of citrus and mint rose into the air, clean and sharp. "Sparkling water with fresh lime and a touch of mint," she said, her tone neutral. "You look like someone who does not actually want alcohol tonight." For the first time, his expression shifted in a way that was not subtle, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he glanced at the glass, then back at her. "You decided that for me?" he asked, not offended, not impressed, just curious, and Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "You said surprise you," she replied, "not impress you." There was a quiet beat, and then something unexpected happened. He let out a small breath that almost resembled a laugh, low and brief, like it had been a long time since he had done it without thinking. He picked up the glass, took a slow sip, and nodded once. "It is good," he admitted, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted into something else, something less like a test and more like a conversation that neither of them had planned. Sophie placed the appetizer gently in front of him. "This is not on the menu," she added. "The kitchen had extra, and I thought you might prefer something light before the steak." He studied the plate for a second, then looked back at her. "You do this often?" he asked, and she shrugged lightly. "Only when it makes sense," she said, and there it was again, that same grounded certainty, not trying to win him over, not trying to stand out, just doing what she believed was right in the moment, and that, more than anything else, seemed to hold his attention. Across the room, the manager watched carefully, arms crossed, clearly expecting something to go wrong, but nothing did. No raised voices, no dismissive gestures, no awkward exit. Instead, table 12 had become the quietest place in the restaurant, not because it was tense, but because it was focused, like everything around it had faded into the background. "Tell me something else," he said after another bite, his voice softer now, less guarded. "Why this job?" Sophie paused, just briefly, not because she was afraid to answer, but because she chose her words carefully. "Because it pays the bills," she said simply, then added, "and because I am good at reading people." His eyes narrowed slightly, interested. "And what do you read from me?" he asked, and this time, there was no challenge in the question, just curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that did not come from power, but from wanting to understand something unexpected. Sophie considered him for a second, then spoke. "You are not here for the food," she said, "and you are definitely not here for the service." A faint smile touched his lips. "Barely there. Go on," he said, leaning back slightly, and she continued, her voice calm, steady. "You are here to see how people react when they think you are difficult." Another pause, longer this time, heavier, but not uncomfortable, just honest, and for a moment, he said nothing. Did nothing, just looked at her as if she had stepped into a space most people never even noticed existed. Then he set his fork down carefully, his fingers resting against the edge of the plate. "And what is your reaction?" he asked quietly, and Sophie did not hesitate, not even for a second. "You are not difficult," she said, "you are just waiting for someone to treat you like you are not." The word settled between them, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret, and for the first time since he had walked into that restaurant, the man at table 12 had no immediate response, no controlled reply, no calculated move, just silence, real silence, the kind that comes when something true lands exactly where it is supposed to. For a few seconds, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into something distant, like it no longer belonged to this table, and Alexander Hayes remained still, his gaze fixed on Sophie as if recalculating everything he thought he understood about people, about patterns, about control, because what she had just said was not flattery, not defiance, not even rebellion. It was something far more dangerous to someone like him. It was clarity, and clarity could not be manipulated. "You think you understand me," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, and Sophie did not rush to respond. She simply adjusted the position of his glass slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table in a small, almost unconscious gesture of order before meeting his eyes again. "No," she said calmly, "I think I understand what you are doing." That answer lingered longer than the last, and this time, there was no immediate shift, no quick recovery. Instead, something deeper moved behind his expression, something that had been buried under years of control and precision, and for the first time, he leaned forward, not as a test, not as a tactic, but as someone genuinely engaged. "And what exactly am I doing?" he asked, and Sophie held his gaze without hesitation. "You are watching how far people will bend before they break," she said, her voice steady, "and deciding who is worth noticing based on that." There was no accusation in her tone, just observation, and that made it impossible to dismiss. His fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion that betrayed just enough tension to be real. "And you did not bend," he said, more statement than question, and Sophie gave a slight shake of her head. "No," she replied, "because I am not here to be chosen." The words landed with a quiet finality that shifted the air between them yet again, and for a moment, Alexander said nothing. His usual responses, sharp and calculated, did not come, because this was not a situation he had designed. This was not a reaction he had predicted, and across the room, the manager stepped closer, his patience thinning as he watched the interaction stretch longer than any before it. "Sophie," he called out, trying to keep his voice low but firm, "we need you at table 6, but Sophie did not move immediately, her attention still anchored to the man in front of her. And before she could respond, Alexander spoke without looking away from her. "She will finish here first." His tone was not raised, not aggressive, but it carried a weight that made the manager stop mid-step, uncertain, caught between authority and something he could not quite define. Sophie exhaled softly, just once, then straightened slightly. "I will be back with your main course in a few minutes," she said, her voice returning to its professional cadence, and this time, when she turned to leave, the movement felt different, not like an escape, not like relief, but like a deliberate pause in something that was still unfolding. And as she walked back toward the kitchen, the whispers started again, quieter but sharper now. "What did she say to him?" one server asked, leaning in. "He has never stayed this long," another added, and Sophie did not answer them. She simply stepped into the kitchen, the heat and noise crashing back around her, orders being called, plates sliding across counters. But her mind stayed steady, focused, grounded. in the same place it had been when she first walked up to that table, and behind her, in the dining room, Alexander Hayes sat back slowly in his chair, his gaze following her path until she disappeared behind the kitchen doors, his hand resting near the edge of the plate, untouched for the moment, not because the food was not good, but because something far more interesting had just begun, something he had not planned, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about control, or outcomes, or results, he was thinking about her. The kitchen noise wrapped around Sophie the moment she stepped inside, the sharp calls of orders, the hiss of the grill, the clatter of plates stacking against stainless steel, but none of it pulled her off balance. She moved through it with practiced ease, picking up the ribeye plate just as it was finished, the aroma rich and warm, the juices still settling across the surface, and for a brief second, she paused, not out of hesitation, but intention, because something about this table, about this man, was no longer routine. It was precise, deliberate, like every step mattered more than usual. Table 12, the chef called, sliding the plate toward her, and Sophie nodded once, steady as ever, before turning back toward the dining floor. As she stepped out, the shift in energy was immediate, subtle but present. Conversations dipped slightly, glances flickered toward her, toward the plate in her hands, toward the table that had become the center of quiet attention without anyone openly acknowledging it, and across the room, Alexander Hayes had not moved much, but his posture had changed, not relaxed, not guarded, something in between, like someone waiting for a continuation rather than an outcome. Sophie approached without rushing, setting the plate down carefully in front of him, aligning it with the same quiet precision as before. "Ribeye, medium rare," she said, her tone even. "Let me know if you need anything else." And just as she began to step back, his voice stopped her, not sharp, not commanding, just present. "Wait," he said, and Sophie paused, turning slightly, her expression unchanged. "Sit," he added, gesturing faintly toward the empty chair across from him. The request hung in the air, unusual, inappropriate by most restaurant standards, and immediately, a ripple of tension spread through the nearby staff. The manager stiffened near the bar, ready to intervene, but Sophie did not react the way they expected. She did not look offended, did not look flustered. She simply looked at him for a moment, measuring not the request, but the intent behind it. "I cannot sit," she said calmly, "but I can stand for a moment if you have a question." Her answer was clear, respectful, and unyielding all at once, and for a second, Alexander's gaze sharpened, not in frustration, but in recognition, as if confirming something he had already started to suspect. "You always do that?" he asked. "Hold the line like that?" Sophie gave a small shrug, almost imperceptible. "I follow the rules that make sense," she replied, and there it was again, that balance he could not disrupt, not with authority, not with pressure, not even with curiosity. He picked up his knife and cut into the steak, the blade moving cleanly through, revealing exactly the temperature he had asked for. He took a bite, chewed slowly, but his attention was no longer on the food, it remained on her. "Tell me something real," he said after swallowing. "Not something you say to customers." Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering, then answered without delay. "Most people who walk in here want to be seen," she said, "but they do not know how to ask for it without making someone else feel smaller." The words landed with the same quiet weight as before, and Alexander leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not irritated, not defensive, just thinking, really thinking. "And me?" he asked, his voice lower now, more direct. Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "You already know how to be seen," she said. "You just do not trust what happens when you are." Silence followed, not empty, but full, the kind that stretches just enough to make everything around it feel sharper, clearer, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by a table, or a role, or a title. It was defined by something far more unpredictable: understanding. And across the room, the manager finally stepped forward, unable to ignore it any longer. "Sophie," he said, his tone tight, "we need you back on the floor, and this time." Sophie nodded, turning slightly. "I will check back shortly," she said to Alexander, her voice returning to its professional cadence. But as she walked away, something had shifted again, not just in him, but in the room itself, because for the first time, the man no one dared to serve was no longer the most difficult part of table 12. The truth was, the rest of the evening moved forward, but not in the way it had before, not with the usual rhythm of orders and refills and polite smiles exchanged out of habit, because something at table 12 had shifted the balance, even if no one said it out loud, and Sophie felt it in the way conversations paused half a second longer when she passed, in the way the manager kept glancing toward the table as if waiting for something to go wrong, and yet nothing did, not even when she returned to check on him, because Alexander Hayes had not reverted back to the version of himself the staff had grown used to. He did not wave her away, did not dismiss her presence. Instead he looked up as she approached, not with expectation, but with attention, the kind that stayed even after the moment passed. "Everything prepared correctly?" she asked, her tone consistent, professional, and he nodded once, setting his utensils down in a measured motion. "It is," he said, then added after a slight pause, "You were right." Sophie tilted her head slightly, not confused, but curious. "About what?" she asked, and he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary before answering. "Most people do not know how to ask to be seen," he said, his voice quieter now, less guarded than before, and Sophie did not react with surprise or satisfaction. She simply accepted the statement as if it had always been obvious. "It is not something people are taught," she replied, adjusting the position of the plate slightly as she spoke, a small, almost unconscious habit that brought order to the space between them, and Alexander watched the movement, not the plate, but the intention behind it, the consistency, the quiet control that did not rely on power, and for a moment, he said nothing, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table, face down, between them. Sophie's eyes flicked toward it briefly, then back to him. "What is that?" she asked, and he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable again, but not distant, not closed, just composed. "Something you will need tomorrow," he said, and Sophie did not reach for it, did not even look at it again. "I do not take things I have not earned," she replied calmly, and that was the moment. The exact moment when something shifted completely, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no calculation, just truth, and for the first time that night, Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead he studied her, really studied her, as if confirming something final, something that went beyond curiosity or interest, and slowly, he turned the card over himself, revealing a clean, minimal design, a name printed in sharp black letters, and beneath it, a title that did not belong in this setting. Not here, not in this moment, but it was there, undeniable. "Alexander Hayes," he said, his voice steady, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Global. The words did not echo, did not need to, because the impact was immediate, even without anyone else hearing it. Sophie's expression did not change, not dramatically, not the way most people would expect. There was no visible shock, no sudden shift in posture, just a small pause, a fraction of a second where the information settled into place, aligning with everything she had already observed, everything she had already understood without needing confirmation, and then she looked at him again, the same way she had from the beginning. "So that is why you are here," she said quietly, not impressed, not intimidated, just acknowledging the truth, and Alexander held her gaze, something almost like respect settling into his expression. "Yes," he said, "and now you know." Another pause, but this one carried weight, not tension, not conflict, just significance, and Sophie glanced briefly at the card again. Before meeting his eyes once more, "I already did," she said, and with that, the final layer between them was gone, not because of his reveal, but because she had never needed it to begin with. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to continue as if nothing had changed. Plates moved, conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly under warm lighting, but at table 12, something irreversible had already happened, not because of the title on the card, not because of the quiet power behind his name, but because Sophie had not reacted the way the world usually did, and Alexander felt it in a way he could not ignore. The absence of that usual shift, the one where people suddenly adjusted themselves, softened their tone, recalculated their words, but she had not done any of that. She stood exactly the same as before, grounded, composed, untouched by the reveal, and that, more than anything else, held his attention now. "Most people change the moment they know," he said after a second, his voice low, almost reflective, and Sophie gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Most people are trying to get something," she replied. "So they adjust." She reached for the edge of the table, straightening the folded napkin slightly, her movements precise, familiar, and completely unaffected. "I am not," she added, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any reaction could have. Alexander watched her carefully, not as a test anymore, not as an evaluation, but as someone trying to understand something rare, something he could not categorize easily. You could be, he said, not as pressure, not as an offer, just as a possibility most people would see this as an opportunity. Sophie met his gaze, steady as ever. That depends on what you think an opportunity is, she replied, and there it was again, that quiet refusal to be pulled into a framework she did not believe in, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said without raising their voices. Across the room, the manager finally stepped closer, unable to hold back any longer, his eyes flicking from Sophie to Alexander, then to the card still resting on the table, his expression tightening as realization began to settle in. Sir, he said carefully, his tone shifting into something more formal, more cautious. If there is anything we can do to improve your experience tonight. But Alexander did not look at him, did not acknowledge the shift. His attention remained on Sophie. There is, he said calmly, but it is already happening. The manager hesitated, unsure how to respond, caught between his usual authority and something much larger, something he could not control, and Sophie, sensing the shift, stepped back slightly, restoring the boundary between staff and guest, not because she felt smaller, but because she chose where that line belonged. I should continue my section, she said, her tone returning fully to professional, but her presence unchanged, and as she turned to leave, Alexander spoke again, not loudly, not urgently, but enough to stop her for one more second. Tomorrow, he said, and Sophie paused, glancing back just slightly. There will be a meeting, he continued, everyone will be there. There was no elaboration, no explanation, just a statement that carried intention beneath it. Sophie held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once, not as agreement, not as submission, just acknowledgement. Then I will see what happens tomorrow, she said, and with that, she walked away, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, leaving behind not tension, not uncertainty, but something far more rare, anticipation. And for the first time since this entire situation began, Alexander Hayes did not feel like the one in control of what came next. He felt like he was waiting for it. The next morning did not begin with noise, it began with silence, the kind that fills a room before something important happens, and Sophie felt it the moment she stepped into the restaurant. The lights brighter than usual, the tables cleared, chairs aligned in perfect rows facing the front, no menus, no customers, just staff gathered in quiet clusters, whispering in low voices that carried more uncertainty than curiosity. And at the center of it all stood the manager, his posture rigid, his usual confidence replaced with something tighter, more controlled, as if he had been given instructions he did not fully understand. Everyone, take a seat, he said, his voice sharper than normal, and Sophie did not hesitate. She moved forward calmly, choosing a seat near the middle, not hiding, not standing out, just present, grounded, exactly as she had been the night before. Around her, waitresses exchanged glances, some nervous, some confused. One leaned in and whispered, "Do you think this is about last night?" Sophie did not answer, her attention already shifting toward the front as the doors behind the manager opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to draw every eye in the room at once, and then he walked in, not in the same understated way as before, but with a presence that filled the space without effort, dressed in a tailored suit, posture precise, every detail aligned with the title he had revealed the night before. Alexander Hayes did not need to announce himself. The room reacted. Before he spoke, chairs straightened, whispers stopped, the air tightened, and the manager stepped aside immediately, his authority dissolving into something secondary. "Good morning," Alexander said, his voice calm, measured, carrying across the room without strain. "I appreciate you all being here early." No one responded, not out of disrespect, but because no one knew how to. The shift in power was too sudden, too clear, and Sophie watched quietly, her expression unchanged, the same steady awareness she had held from the beginning. "For the past few weeks," he continued, "I have been visiting this location without introduction." A ripple of tension moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, observing service, consistency, and more importantly, character. His eyes moved across the staff, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging, until they paused, briefly, on Sophie, then moved on again, as if nothing had happened. "But the moment had been enough. What I found," he said, "was exactly what I expected." A few shoulders tightened, a few eyes dropped, and exactly what I did not. The statement hung in the air, unclear, deliberate, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he made it clear. "Some of you perform your roles," he said, but very few of you understand them. The manager shifted slightly beside him, uncomfortable now. Caught in the same evaluation as everyone else, service is not about control, Alexander continued, it is not about compliance, and it is not about making yourself smaller to satisfy someone else's ego. His words were not harsh, but they were precise, and they landed exactly where they needed to. It is about awareness, he said, and respect, given freely, not forced. A pause followed, long enough for the meaning to settle, and then he stepped forward slightly, just one step, but it changed the entire focus of the room. There was one person here last night who understood that, he said, and without hesitation, without drama, his gaze moved directly to her, Sophie Bennett. The room shifted instantly, heads turning, eyes widening, whispers forming before being quickly suppressed, and Sophie did not react the way they expected. She did not look surprised, did not shrink under the attention, she simply stood when her name was called, calm, steady, exactly as she had been from the start, and in that moment, the difference between her and everyone else became undeniable. Every eye in the room was on Sophie, but she did not rush, did not stumble, did not glance around for reassurance. She simply stood, shoulders relaxed, chin level, as if her name being called by the most powerful man in the room was just another moment to move through, not something to react to. And Alexander Hayes watched that carefully, not as a CEO now, but as a man confirming something he already knew. Step forward, he said, his voice calm, and Sophie did, one step, then another, stopping at a respectful distance, not too close, not too far, exactly where she chose to stand, the room holding its breath around them. Last night, Alexander continued, turning slightly so that his words addressed everyone, but his focus remained on her. I gave this team the same condition I have tested in multiple locations. A few staff members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes lowering as the weight of that statement settled in. Pressure, uncertainty, and the opportunity to either perform or understand. He paused briefly, then added, most chose to perform. His gaze swept the room once, not harsh, not accusing, just factual. One chose to understand, and again, his attention returned to Sophie, not with surprise, but with certainty. She did not adjust when she felt pressure, she did not change when she sensed control, and she did not treat me differently when she learned who I was. The words landed with clarity, stripping away any doubt about what mattered, and Sophie remained still, not proud, not uncomfortable, just present, as if none of this changed who she was. That is not just good service, Alexander said, that is leadership. A ripple moved through the room, this time impossible to ignore, because this was no longer about one shift or one table. It was something bigger, something that redefined the rules they thought they understood. The manager shifted beside him again, his posture tightening as realization fully set in, and then Alexander reached into his jacket once more, pulling out a folded document, placing it in Sophie's hands without ceremony, without build-up. Just action, effective immediately, he said. You will step into a new role as guest experience consultant for this location. The words echoed in the silence that followed, not loudly, but clearly enough to change everything. Sophie looked down at the paper briefly, not scanning it, not reacting to the title, just acknowledging it, then looked back up at him, her expression steady, unchanged. Why me? She asked, not out of disbelief, but out of clarity, and Alexander held her gaze, answering without hesitation, because you did not try to be chosen, he said, and that is exactly why you are. The simplicity of that answer settled between them, and for the first time, a subtle shift appeared in Sophie's expression, not shock, not excitement, just recognition, like something had aligned in a way that made sense. I will do the job, she said after a second, her voice calm, grounded, but I will do it my way. A few heads turned at that, surprised by the condition, but Alexander did not hesitate, did not challenge it. Instead, something almost like approval crossed his expression. That is the only way it works, he replied, and in that moment, the power dynamic that had defined the room dissolved into something else entirely, not control, not hierarchy, but mutual respect, the kind that could not be demanded or faked, only earned. And as the meeting slowly began to shift, the tension releasing into quiet conversation, one thing remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it. The person who had changed everything in that room was not the one with the title, but the one who never needed it to begin with.